The candle was never meant to be lit. It was just there, from last year, tucked behind the sugar jar, half melted, a little dusty. But tonight, her fingers reached for it without thinking, like muscle memory rooted in hope. She placed it on the kitchen table, next to a slice of lemon cake she bought herself, and for a moment, the flame danced as if someone had just whispered her name. But the room stayed quiet. No calls, no messages. Just the faint sound of the wind brushing past the window like someone hurrying away. And that was when she realized being forgotten doesn't always arrive with a slammed door or a harsh goodbye. Sometimes it slips in softly, disguised as silence. And she asked herself, not aloud, but with every inch of her aching chest, when did remembering me stop mattering to him? Elaine lived above a flower shop that smelled permanently of lavender, dust, and old wrapping paper. The shop had been her aunt's before, and now it was hers, a quiet space in a quieter town, somewhere near the coast where the wind always arrived 5 minutes earlier than expected. From the outside, her life looked gently stitched together. Morning tea at 7, classical music on the radio, and fresh roses in the window by 9. But routine, as she often reminded herself, was not the same as joy. It was survival in a softer disguise. She was 47, independent, kind, and a little tired of being the strong one. After a long-ago divorce and a few half-hearted romances, she had stopped expecting grand gestures, but there was still one day in the year when a part of her, a younger, more foolish version, waited. Not for a gift, nor a surprise, but simply for someone to remember. Michael had been in her life for 2 years. He was charming, inconsistent, and always on time with wine, but never with sentiment. He kissed her like he meant it, and left like it meant nothing. Their relationship existed in a gray area, warm but undefined. And while Elaine had never asked for more, tonight, the absence of even a simple message echoed louder than any fight ever could. She wasn't angry. She was just reminded that there are silences heavy enough to make you question your place in someone's world. The flat was quiet. A single slice of lemon cake sat on the counter. The candle had burned for 12 minutes before she blew it out without making a wish. Have you ever told someone it didn't matter, just to make it hurt a little less when they proved you right? Let me know. Maybe we're not as alone as we feel. Elaine hadn't meant to stay up that late. She told herself she was tired, that the day had been long, that birthdays didn't mean much after a certain age. But still, she lingered in the kitchen. She kept checking the time, casually at first, then with a strange kind of hopefulness she didn't want to admit. The lemon cake she'd bought sat untouched, its plastic lid fogged with condensation. It wasn't her favorite, just the, only one left at the store. The candle was a leftover from last year, slightly bent, with a wick that sputtered more than it burned. She lit it anyway. The phone stayed quiet. A few messages had come in. Her co-worker, a customer from the flower shop, even her dentist's office, but not him, not Michael. At 8:03 p.m., she told herself he was busy. At 9:14 p.m., she reminded herself he was forgetful with dates. By 10:27 p.m., she whispered, half aloud, that she didn't care. But the truth was, she remembered everything. She remembered the year he brought wine on her birthday but forgot the card, and how she laughed and kissed him anyway. She remembered how he always asked about her favorite songs, but never actually made a playlist. She remembered the way he once said, "You're not the kind of woman who needs reminders. You carry everything inside you." And somehow, that had felt like praise back then. But tonight, it felt like a permission slip to be forgotten. When midnight came, she didn't cry. She just folded a piece of stationery in half, opened the drawer, and took out the envelope she'd saved for something special. A letter, maybe. Or an apology. Or a goodbye. Instead, she wrote a date. October 8th, 11:59 p.m. Then one sentence. I didn't want a present. I just wanted to be remembered. And that, she realized, was the kind of sentence you never send. Because if you have to explain why being remembered matters, then you're already not. She placed the letter into the envelope without sealing it, as if still undecided whether this was grief or something softer, something like clarity, something that didn't hurt sharply, but ached quietly, like a bruise she hadn't noticed until someone pressed against it. Upstairs, the window was open just enough to let in the sound of the wind and the distant clang of boats knocking gently at the dock. Life was still happening out there, but inside, the world had stilled. She took a sip of tea, cold now, and sat in the silence she'd prepared all day for, yet still wasn't ready to greet. She placed the envelope on the table without looking, at it again, as if even eye contact might turn the moment into something too real. The flame on the candle had already begun to lean. The wax curling over the edge, like it too, was giving up. She didn't blow it out yet. There was something quietly rebellious in letting it die on its own, like saying, I won't be the one to end this. In the quiet that followed, Elaine found herself remembering another birthday, her 33rd, the last one with her ex-husband. He had remembered, yes. There was dinner, champagne, a bouquet that looked like it came from a gas station. But the thing she remembered most clearly was how alone she had felt sitting across from someone who thought presence could replace presence of mind. The irony wasn't lost on her. Tonight, Michael had forgotten entirely, and yet she felt the same hollow ache as she did that year, sitting across a candle-lit table with someone who had said all the right things, but none of the true ones. Back. Then, she'd stayed quiet, smiled through the whole evening, even thanked him for remembering. Tonight there was no one to thank, no need to pretend, and somehow, that honesty hurt more. She reached for her phone again, not to check for messages, this time, but to scroll through old photos. Not many of Michael. He wasn't fond of being photographed, but there was one, taken last spring. He was looking away, half smiling, caught mid-sentence. She had always liked that photo because it looked like how she wanted him to feel about her, unguarded, almost tender. She wondered, absurdly, if he had a similar photo of her, if he ever scrolled through his camera roll and paused when her face came up. Or if she lived in his phone the way she was beginning to fade from his life, in silent deletion. The candle gave one last flicker and went out. Elaine didn't move. Sometimes it wasn't the forgetting that broke you. It was the fact that they didn't even realize they had. Have you ever waited for someone to remember you, without saying a word, just to see if they would? If you have, then you already know how it ends. The next morning came without ceremony. Elaine woke up to the dull gray of a sky that hadn't made up its mind, half cloud, half light. The apartment was silent in the way places are after a realization, like the air itself had heard what she hadn't said aloud. She moved slowly, poured coffee she didn't finish, fed the cat even though the cat had been gone for 3 years. Old habits outlived old companions. As she opened the shop downstairs, the bell above the door chimed like it always did, a sweet little sound she had stopped hearing long ago. But today it startled her, as if it rang not for a customer, but for her, calling her back to something forgotten. That was when she saw it, tucked into the corner of the front counter, beneath a stack of order slips and unused ribbon. A small, square envelope, cream-colored, smudged faintly on the corner. Her breath caught. She didn't remember placing it there. She reached for it with that strange hesitation reserved for memory, part fear, part longing. Inside was a card. No handwriting, no note. Just a printed message. Happy birthday. Let's do something this weekend. M. No date, no time. No warmth. Just intention. She stood there a long time, the card still open in her hand. The part of her that had waited all night wanted to feel something: relief, validation, even a twinge of apology on his behalf. But what settled inside her instead was a quiet, unflinching truth. He hadn't remembered yesterday. He had remembered sometime after. Perhaps late at night, after seeing someone else's post, or flipping through his calendar with guilt. This wasn't memory. It was reaction. Elaine placed the card on the counter, beside the scissors and the florist's tape, and turned away. Something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, and no one else would have noticed, but inside her, a very old hope let go of its grip. Later that day, a woman came in to order sympathy flowers. Her husband had passed, and she wanted something not too showy, but not sad either. Elaine suggested white lilies, pale roses. The woman nodded, then paused and said almost absently, "He never remembered our anniversary, but he remembered to leave me notes in the fridge. I guess we choose which memories to hold on to." Elaine smiled softly. And which ones to let go of? She thought of Michael, of the way he said her name when he was half asleep, of the way he never noticed when she wore earrings, of the birthday card, lying there like a late apology wrapped in obligation. And then she thought of the letter upstairs, the one she had written but not sealed. It didn't need sending anymore. It had already done its work. That evening, she made soup, read a few pages of an old novel, and didn't check her phone. At 9 p.m., it buzzed anyway. A text. "Hey, sorry about yesterday. Let me make it up to you?" She stared at it for a moment. Then, without bitterness, without anything really, she placed the phone face down and returned to her book. Because something inside her had already said what needed to be said. If you forget the day I came into the world, then I need to rethink the place I hold in yours. She hadn't planned to feel so clear. But sometimes clarity doesn't arrive as a grand epiphany. Sometimes it arrives in lowercase, unsigned, and too late. The next morning came without ceremony. Elaine woke up to the dull gray of a sky that hadn't made up its mind, half cloud, half light. The apartment was silent in the way places are after a realization, like the air itself had heard what she hadn't said aloud. She moved slowly, poured coffee she didn't finish, fed the cat even though the cat had been gone for 3 years. Old habits outlived old companions. As she opened the shop downstairs, the bell above the door chimed like it always did, a sweet little sound she had stopped hearing long ago. But today it startled her, as if it rang not for a customer but for her, calling her back to something forgotten. That was when she saw it, tucked into the corner of the front counter, beneath a stack of order slips and unused ribbon. A small, square envelope, cream-colored, smudged faintly on the corner. Her breath caught. She didn't remember placing it there. She reached for it with that strange hesitation reserved for memory, part fear, part longing. Inside was a card. No handwriting, no note. Just a printed message. "Happy birthday. Let's do something this weekend. M." No date, no time. No warmth. Just intention. She stood there a long time, the card still open in her hand. The part of her that had waited all night wanted to feel something: relief, validation, even a twinge of apology on his behalf. But what settled inside her instead was a quiet, unflinching truth. He hadn't remembered yesterday. He had remembered sometime after. Perhaps late at night, after seeing someone else's post, or flipping through his calendar with guilt. This wasn't memory. It was reaction. Elaine placed the card on the counter, beside the scissors and the florist's tape, and turned away. Something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, and no one else would have noticed, but inside her, a very old hope let go of its grip. Later that day, a woman came in to order sympathy flowers. Her husband had passed, and she wanted something not too showy, but not sad either. Elaine suggested white lilies, pale roses. The woman nodded, then paused and said almost absently, "He never remembered our anniversary, but he remembered to leave me notes in the fridge. I guess we choose which memories to hold on to." Elaine smiled softly. And which ones to let go of? She thought of Michael, of the way he said her name when he was half asleep, of the way he never noticed when she wore earrings, of the birthday card, lying there like a late apology wrapped in obligation. And then she thought of the letter upstairs, the one she had written but not sealed. It didn't need sending anymore. It had already done its work. That evening, she made soup, read a few pages of an old novel, and didn't check her phone. At 9 p.m., it buzzed anyway. A text. "Hey, sorry about yesterday. Let me make it up to you?" She stared at it for a moment. Then, without bitterness, without anything really, she placed the phone face down and returned to her book. Because something inside her had already said what needed to be said. If you forget the day I came into the world, then I need to rethink the place I hold in yours. She hadn't planned to feel so clear. But sometimes clarity doesn't arrive as a grand epiphany. Sometimes it arrives in lowercase, unsigned, and too late. Elaine had always believed that if she ever fell out of love, it would be sudden. A slammed door, a betrayal, a moment that would split time into before and after. But now, she knew better. Love didn't always leave in flames. Sometimes it leaked, out slowly, drip by drip, until you were left holding something that looked like love but didn't feel like anything at all. The days that followed her birthday were quiet, almost unnaturally so. Michael texted twice, both short, both signed with his usual dash and initial M, as if love could be boiled down to an abbreviation. She didn't respond. Not out of defiance, but because she didn't know how to say, "I'm fine," without lying, and "I'm not fine," without sounding like she needed something. Instead, she began to rearrange the shop. Something about moving the rose buckets, wiping down the dusty shelves, and reorganizing ribbons by color gave her a strange sense of control. She unearthed a drawer full of cards, thank you notes from customers, old receipts, and a faded envelope addressed in her own handwriting. For a moment, she didn't recognize it. Then she realized it was a letter she'd written to herself the year after her divorce. She'd never meant to keep it. But as she unfolded the paper, her breath caught. "You are not hard to love," it began. "You're just trying to be loved by people who never learned how to stay." She didn't remember writing those words, but she remembered how they felt. The ache of them. The fear that maybe she was too much, too sensitive, too expectant. It was strange, reading it now. Like speaking to a past self who had already walked this road before and was gently reminding her, "This isn't new. But maybe, just maybe, it can end differently this time." That afternoon, she visited the public library, a place she hadn't been in months. It smelled of pages and stillness, and something about the quiet reminded her of childhood. She wandered the aisles without a goal, letting her fingers skim the spines like memories. In the fiction section, she stumbled on a book she had loved at 23, a novel about letters never sent. She pulled it out, flipped through it, and there it was, her favorite passage, underlined in pencil by someone who had borrowed it before her. "We break our own hearts sometimes, just to see if they still work." She smiled, then sat in the corner with the book in her lap, legs folded like a girl who had never learned to sit with disappointment. And in that moment, she let herself go back to a version of Elaine who once thought birthdays were sacred, who used to write postcards she never sent, who once cried because someone remembered her favorite flower without asking. That girl still lived somewhere inside her. Quieter now, but alive. On her way out of the library, she noticed someone familiar sitting near the entrance, a woman with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair tucked into a green scarf. It took a moment, but then she remembered. Ruth. They had worked together, at the flower shop more than a decade ago, before life pulled them in different directions. Ruth had always had a way of speaking gently, even when saying hard things. Elaine hesitated, then walked over. Ruth? The woman looked up, surprised, at first, then her expression softened. Elaine, my goodness, it's been years. They sat on the library steps with takeout coffees, talking like women who'd once shared silence behind counters, and rainy Mondays with too many lilies and not enough smiles. Ruth asked about the shop, about life, about Michael, though Elaine didn't offer much. When she finally did mention the birthday, it came out softer than she'd expected. He forgot. No big scene. No apology that mattered. Just a text the next day. Ruth listened without interruption. Then she said, "The man I was with after my husband passed, he remembered every birthday, but he never once asked what kind of cake I liked." She paused. Sometimes being remembered is not the same as being known. The words lingered long after Ruth had left. Elaine walked home with them like a pebble in her coat pocket, small but pressing. That night, she didn't write another letter. She didn't draft a reply to Michael's text. Instead, she opened her laptop and browsed through old photos stored on an external drive she hadn't touched in years. Amid folders labeled Holidays and Storefront Redesign was one simply titled Moments. Inside, she found a blurry photo of her in the shop at sunset, laughing at something out of frame. It had been taken by a customer's child, accidentally, but she looked full, lit from within. Not because of anyone else, but because she was herself, unfiltered, seen without needing to perform. It was that version of herself she missed most. She printed the photo and pinned it on the fridge. A small act, but important. The next morning, Michael called. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail, casual and vague, suggesting dinner. She played it twice, then deleted it. Not out of malice, but clarity. Later that day, as she was closing the shop, a little girl came in with her mother. The child pointed to a bouquet and whispered, "That one looks like someone remembered you." Elaine smiled. "It does," she said. She wrapped the flowers carefully, and as the girl walked out with them, Elaine stood for a moment in the doorway, watching the world move around her. The sky was beginning to turn gold. Somewhere, someone was remembering someone else. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. And maybe, just maybe, it was time she remembered herself first. That evening, Elaine lit a candle. Not for her birthday this time, but for no reason at all. It sat on the windowsill, its small flame fluttering beside the folded letter she still hadn't sealed. Outside, the town had grown quiet again, with only the distant hum of a passing train and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog, breaking the stillness. In the softness of that hour, she allowed herself a question she hadn't voiced before. When did I start settling for being remembered eventually, instead of being known consistently? She reached for her journal, the one she only wrote in when. She didn't know what else to do with the ache in her chest. Most of the entries were unfinished thoughts, fragments of emotion scribbled late at night and forgotten by morning. But tonight, her pen moved with more certainty. She wrote about the dinner she had once dreamed Michael would plan without prompting, about the necklace she bought herself last Christmas and pretended it was from him, about how many times she had told him, "It's fine," when it wasn't. Each sentence felt like reclaiming something, not from him, but from the version of herself who thought love was about patience alone. That woman was still inside her, but Elaine felt a shift now, as though her voice had returned after years of whispering just to keep the peace. When the ink ran out, she smiled, because she'd finally said it all. 2 days later, she did something she hadn't done in years. She took the afternoon off. No shop errands, no social obligations, no carefully composed responses to texts. She drove to the old lighthouse just outside town, a place she used to visit in her 20s when everything felt possible and uncertain in equal measure. The path was overgrown, the bench by the cliff a little rusted, but the ocean still stretched wide and indifferent in the most comforting way. She sat there for hours, watching the waves fold into each other like time and memory. There, without needing to speak or decide anything, she finally understood something. Letting go doesn't always mean leaving. Sometimes it just means choosing not to wait in the same place anymore. As the wind tugged at her scarf and the sky turned lilac, she whispered, not to Michael, not even to the sea, but to herself, "I remember me." And that, in a quiet way, changed everything. A few days later, while cleaning out the cabinet behind the register, a task she'd avoided for months, Elaine found an old tin box, the kind that once held shortbread biscuits, now dented and covered in a film of dust. She hadn't opened it in years. It was where she kept things that didn't belong anywhere else. Keys that no longer fit locks, notes scribbled on napkins, a pressed flower from a trip she barely remembered. She opened the lid without thinking, then paused. There, nestled between an old concert ticket and a dried eucalyptus leaf, was a folded piece of paper in Michael's handwriting. The date in the corner was from the first year they'd started seeing each other. She unfolded it carefully, half expecting something inconsequential. But it was a list. The title read, "Things to Remember About E." She scanned the bullet. Points. She hates early mornings but loves watching the sky change colors. She pretends not to like birthdays, but always buys cake for herself. She always wears socks to bed even in summer. She talks to flowers when she thinks no one's listening. She never cries in front of people, but she always holds her breath when she's about to. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the last one. "If I forget any of these things, it means I've stopped paying attention. Please don't let me stop paying attention." She stared at the words for a long time, the kind of long where everything around her faded. No clocks ticking, no customers calling, just the sound of her own breath, caught somewhere between nostalgia and disbelief. He had once paid attention. He had once known the exact way she folded into a Sunday morning, and now? She didn't know what hurt more, the fact that he had stopped noticing, or the quiet plea in his own handwriting, asking her to stop him if he ever did. The letter wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't poetry or promise. It was simply a moment of awareness, honest, tender, human. And somewhere along the way, it had been forgotten, buried under routine and unspoken assumptions, left in a biscuit tin, like something too precious to throw away but not important enough to remember. Elaine folded the note gently and held it in her hands, unsure of whether it was evidence of love or the absence of it. She made tea, sat by the window, and let the sky turn its familiar shades of late afternoon gold. The letter lay in her lap like a weight and a gift all at once. Sometimes, it's not the forgetting that breaks you. It's realizing they once knew everything and still let it fade. And still, there was no anger in her, only the ache of something tender once held and quietly dropped. Not out of malice, just carelessness. And isn't that the truest kind? Of heartbreak? He remembered me once, she thought, and then he didn't. Elaine didn't move for a long time. She sat with the letter in her lap and let it press into her like an old song you forgot you loved. It wasn't just the words, though those were delicate enough to split her in half. It was the handwriting, too. The way the E curved softly, The slight slant of the lines like someone trying not to say too much. He'd written it when everything was still in bloom. Before forgetting was a possibility. She thought about the first time he ever noticed something without her saying it. They were walking past a bakery on a cold afternoon, and she had lingered for just a second longer in front of the display case. She hadn't said a word. The next day there was a warm cinnamon bun waiting for her at the shop. No explanation, just presence. But time erodes attentiveness, doesn't it? Not with storms, but with silence. With the choice to look at your phone instead of someone's eyes. With assuming they'll always be there, so you no longer need to pay attention to the small things. The socks in summer, the birthday she says doesn't matter. The silence after a missed call that stretches too long. Elaine reached for a pen and the back of a florist's invoice and wrote slowly, carefully, like carving each word into stone. You knew me once. And then you chose not to. And I stayed anyway, until the forgetting was louder than the remembering. She folded the note in half, tucked it into the same tin, and closed the lid. That night, she did something unexpected. She called her sister, someone she hadn't really spoken to in months. They talked about nothing at first. The weather, soup recipes, a neighbor's new dog. But then her sister asked, "How was your birthday?" Elaine paused, then simply, "Quiet." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Not uncomfortable, just full. Her sister didn't ask more. But the next morning, a package arrived. No return label. Inside, a small cake, a single candle, and a card that said, "In case you need a second try." Elaine cried then, for the first time since the silence began. Not because of Michael, but because someone remembered. And that was enough to remind her what it felt like to matter without asking to. The apartment that evening felt heavier than usual, though nothing had changed. The same curtains swayed in the same breeze, the same kettle hummed quietly on the stove, and the same cat-shaped mug waited for tea she wouldn't drink. But Elaine could feel it, that quiet shift in the atmosphere, the weight of something that had finally settled in her chest. Not grief, not heartbreak, just recognition. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her work clothes, one shoe off and the other forgotten, staring at the envelope she had placed earlier that week on her nightstand. The one with the letter she had written on her birthday. She hadn't opened it since. But tonight, she did. Reading her own words was like listening to someone else speak. Someone braver, maybe, or more honest than she remembered being. And by the time she reached the last line, "You didn't forget the day. I just stopped mattering enough for it to live in your memory." She felt the ache hit her in a place she didn't know had gone numb. She had stayed. That was the thing. Through missed calls and half-promises, through "I'll make it up to you," and "You know I care," she had stayed. Because he wasn't cruel. Because some nights were lovely. Because letting go would mean admitting she had waited for something that would never arrive. She remembered a night 2 months ago. They'd gone out for dinner. She had worn a navy dress, simple but flattering, the one she always reached for when she wanted to feel remembered. Michael hadn't noticed. Instead, he'd spent most of the evening checking his phone, pausing only to laugh at a joke she didn't make. It wasn't until much later, lying beside him in bed, that she'd whispered, "Do you think we're good? Together?" He'd been half asleep, murmured something unintelligible, and rolled away. She never asked again. The tragedy wasn't in that moment. It was in the fact that she had accepted it. Elaine stood up, walked barefoot across the cool, wooden floor, and turned off the kitchen light. Darkness didn't frighten her the way it used to. It felt honest. In the dim glow of the candle she hadn't yet thrown away, her reflection in the window looked older, softer, but somehow more whole. It wasn't the years etched at the corners of her eyes or the faint silver in her hair. It was the quiet behind her gaze, the quiet that comes when a person finally stops trying to convince themselves that love, when rationed, is still love. She sat at the table and listened to the silence, the wind, the ticking clock. She used to fill the silence, turn on music, hum along, speak into the space even when no one else was there. But now, she let the silence stay. Let it wrap around her like a blanket that didn't offer comfort but told the truth. On the fridge, the photo she had printed, blurry, unposed, caught the flickering candlelight. She stared at her own face in it. That woman had laughed without needing to be seen. She hadn't waited for permission to feel joy. Elaine reached for the phone, not to call Michael, but to scroll back through their messages. She scrolled and scrolled, through apologies, through half-hearted plans, through weeks of silence punctuated by jokes and shared links. Not one, "How are you, really?" Not one, "What do you need?" And then, as if pulled by something deeper than memory, she opened the voice memo app. A year ago, Michael had sent her a recording, a piano melody he'd written late one night. He'd said it reminded him of her. She hadn't listened to it since. Now she pressed play. The music was raw, unfinished. Some notes stumbled, some stretched too long. But it was beautiful in its imperfection, vulnerable in a way he no longer was. She closed her eyes and let it fill the room. And when it ended, she whispered to the dark, "I wish you had stayed that version of yourself." But even as she said it, she knew. It wasn't just about him. It was about her. The version of herself that she had buried under patience and lowered expectations. The woman who waited quietly while her own birthday passed. The woman who accepted crumbs and convinced herself they were cake. The real tragedy wasn't being forgotten. It was that she had forgotten herself. The next morning, Elaine did something she hadn't done in years. She stayed in bed after the sun came up. She let the light stretch across the room, golden and quiet, until it reached the foot of her bed like an old friend too gentle to wake her. She watched it with the stillness of someone who had survived something. Nothing explosive, nothing visible. Just the long unraveling of hope. She thought about how many birthdays had passed without cake, how many mornings she'd made tea for two and poured only one cup. Thought about the way Michael would kiss her goodbye without looking up from his phone, how she'd started saying, "Take care," instead of, "I'll miss you." Tiny substitutions that seemed harmless until they added up to something unrecognizable. She got up slowly, pulled her sweater around her shoulders, and walked barefoot into the kitchen. Everything looked the same. The same dish left to dry, the same unopened mail, the same quiet. But today, she moved through it with different eyes. Eyes that no longer looked for signs of being loved, but for signs that she had survived loving in vain. She opened the cupboard and pulled down a tin of Earl Grey tea, one her mother used to drink. As she waited for the kettle to boil, her hand brushed the edge of the photo she had taped to the fridge, the laughing version of her. She looked at it now not with longing, but with quiet recognition. She wasn't that woman anymore. But maybe she could be someone else. Someone better. Someone whole. Then, with a suddenness that felt like instinct, Elaine returned to her desk and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. She didn't write to Michael. She didn't write about birthdays or forgetting or almost love. She wrote to herself. You stayed too long in rooms that stopped holding you. You believed silence was patience. You made homes in people who never asked you to move in. But you're still here, and that means something. She signed it without a name, folded it in half, slid it beside the old letter, and this time sealed the envelope. It was not a goodbye. It was a beginning. It had been over a week since the voicemail, and Elaine hadn't heard from Michael since. Not another message. Not even the usual Friday night check-in. She didn't miss the silence, but she noticed it. Like noticing that a painting has been taken down from a familiar wall. The absence itself was not painful anymore, but it drew your eye. It made you remember that something had once been there. That Saturday, she went to the market early. It was quiet, with the gentle clatter of baskets and the hushed conversations of vendors still setting up. She bought fresh tulips, white ones, and some lemons she didn't need, simply because they reminded her of the cake she hadn't eaten she passed the used bookstore near the corner. Something made her pause. It had been years since she'd stepped inside. She didn't need another book. But the window display caught her eye. A collection of vintage cards, faded with time, one of them with gold script that read, "For someone I forgot to thank." On impulse, she pushed open the door. The bell above the frame chimed, and the scent of old paper and ink welcomed her like an old friend. She wandered between shelves, letting her fingers trail over spines until she reached the back corner, where poetry and old letters were kept in wooden boxes. There, tucked beneath a collection of hand-bound journals, she found something that made her breath catch. It was a notebook. Her notebook. The cover was unmistakable, floral with a small ink stain at the bottom right corner. She had lost it nearly 2 years ago during a move. She thought she had thrown it out by mistake. Inside were letters she had written but never sent. Notes from quiet mornings, quotes from books she loved, and tucked into the back flap, a folded scrap of paper, yellowed and creased. She opened it. It was a note. From Michael. "I found this. I didn't know if you meant to lose it. I read one letter. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. But it made me understand you better than I ever had when you spoke. You said you don't ask for much, but you feel everything deeply. I don't know how to carry that without dropping it. But I'm trying, even if I don't always show it." She read it twice, 3 times. Her hands trembled, not with sadness, but with the sharp, aching tenderness of a truth arriving too late. Elaine sat down on the small wooden stool tucked beneath the poetry shelf. Her knees shook slightly, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what she had just read. The store faded around her. No more murmurs of other customers, no dust in the air. Just the quiet hum of clarity settling into her chest. He had seen her, at least once. Long enough to know she felt more than she said. Long enough to fear he couldn't hold it. And maybe that was why he forgot the birthday. Not because he didn't care, but because caring scared him. Because when people know how deeply you need to be remembered, they become afraid of the cost of failing. And yet, he had failed anyway. That note, hidden in a lost notebook, was not a redemption. It didn't erase the missed days, the absent voice, but it reframed them. Michael hadn't stopped caring. He'd simply stopped showing it in ways that mattered. He had been overwhelmed by her softness, unsure what to do with a woman who didn't demand love, but offered it freely and expected only to be felt in return. Elaine folded the note slowly, carefully, and slid it back into the notebook. It would remain there, not as proof of what could have been, but as a reminder. She was not invisible. She had never been. On her walk home, the air felt lighter somehow, not because anything had been resolved, but because the silence finally had a shape. It was no longer a void, but a choice. His choice. His fear. Not her absence. When she reached her front door, she paused. The bouquet of tulips, still fresh, swayed in the breeze. She smiled and whispered, as if to herself, "I forgive you, but I won't wait for you to say it first." That night, she lit a candle not for remembrance, but for release. She placed the old letter and the new one in the biscuit tin, sealed the lid, and stored it in the back of her closet. Some truths don't need revisiting once you've lived through them. Have you ever found out, too late, that someone saw you more clearly than you thought? Later that night, as she sat by the open window with a cup of tea in her hands, Elaine watched the sky darken into that deep navy blue that only arrived when the day had nothing left to prove. The streets were quiet, and the glow from the street lamp painted long, delicate shadows across the floor. She thought again of the notebook, of the words written in a moment of rare honesty. And then she thought about how long she had waited, not just for him to say something like that, but for any sign that her softness wasn't a burden, that her silence was not emptiness, but space, that her waiting was not weakness, but hope. And now, even with the words finally found, they no longer carried the power to heal what had already unraveled. Not because they weren't true, but because they came after. She reached for her own letter, unfinished, unsent, and added one final line. "You understood me once, but I needed you to remember me longer than just one page." She folded it again, tucked it into the same notebook, and this time, when she placed it back on the shelf, it felt less like storing grief and more like laying a memory gently to rest. Sunday mornings used to ache in Elaine's chest, softly, without announcement. It wasn't just the quiet or the slow rhythm of a town still asleep. It was the weight of what was missing. 2 cups of coffee instead of one, idle conversation about nothing in particular, someone to notice the way she hummed while watering the plants. But not today. Today. Elaine woke with the windows open and the sun warming her sheets. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, sliced a pear onto her favorite chipped plate, and turned on the old radio that always crackled slightly on cold mornings. The jazz station played something slow and strange and full of spaces, and for once, the spaces didn't feel empty. She took her breakfast to the small bistro table by the window, wrapped herself in the soft gray shawl she always reached for on thinking days, and watched the town come alive. The bakery opened its shutters. A boy chased his hat across the pavement. A couple walked by, laughing about something she couldn't hear. Elaine didn't feel the ache today. Not because she'd forgotten, but because she had remembered herself, fully, quietly, with the kind of grace that doesn't arrive all at once, but gathers in the corners of a life and waits to be noticed. Later that afternoon, Elaine took a walk to the cliffs beyond the old lighthouse. She hadn't been there since the day she let the sea carry her silence. This time, she brought no letters, no questions, only herself, and that was enough. The wind tugged at her scarf as she stood at the edge, watching the waves arrive and leave, over and over again. Something about that rhythm, the coming and going, felt familiar now. Love had done the same in her life, arrived gently, stayed for a while, and left without slamming the door. And just like the sea, it wasn't meant to be held forever. It was meant to be felt, learned from, and then released. As she turned to head back, she passed by a young woman seated on a bench, visibly upset, phone in hand, wiping tears without trying to hide them. Elaine hesitated for only a second before reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a small card from the bookstore, the one that said, "For someone I forgot to thank." She handed it to the girl without a word. The girl looked up, startled. At first, then nodded through tears, and Elaine smiled. Not the kind of smile that says, "I understand everything," but the kind that says, "You're not as alone as you feel right now." That evening, back home, she opened her tin box one last time. She didn't read the letters. She didn't need to. She simply added one more slip of paper, blank, untouched, a space for what might come next. Not every story ends in a grand love. Some end with a woman lighting her own candle, whispering her own name, and learning to find warmth not in being remembered, but in remembering herself. If someone once forgot you on the day it mattered most, tell me. What did you do with the silence they left behind? Maybe someone out there is still listening. That night, Elaine did something small, but significant. She opened her calendar, the one she used for grocery lists and shop deliveries, and circled the date of her birthday. Not because she wanted to remind someone else, but because she wanted to remind herself. Next year, she would buy the cake early. She would invite someone, maybe Ruth, maybe no one. Maybe she would just take herself to the sea with a thermos of tea and a book of poems. She wrote in the margin beside the circle, "You are worth remembering." Not as a plea, not as a declaration, just a fact. In the quiet that followed, Elaine did something else. She opened her inbox. Not to look for old messages, but to write a new one. It wasn't to Michael. It was to her niece, a college freshman she hadn't spoken to in months. She wrote, "I hope you're settling in well. Do you still like lemon cake? I've found a bakery that makes one better than I ever managed. Tell me about your new life. I want to remember things about you." She hit send before she could doubt herself, because she knew now. Being remembered starts with remembering others, with choosing to see someone when they aren't asking to be seen. Then, before bed, she placed a single tulip in a vase beside her window. Not because anyone would see it, but because she would. And that, this time, was enough. She turned off the light. The room fell into darkness, but she did not feel alone in it. She felt whole. She had not been chosen in the way she once dreamed of, but she had chosen herself. And in that quiet choosing, there was a different kind of love, one that stayed. So tell me, what was the moment you decided you didn't need them to remember you anymore? Because maybe that's when your story truly began.